Alright, the purpose of this video is to take you through the very basic steps of setting up your first solution stack. The solution stack that we are going to be working with, first of all, is a PHP based solution stack. It's called XAMPP. There are other flavors out there that combine PHP with Apache and MySQL, such as WAMP and so on, but we're going to be using XAMPP in particular. You can use WAMP if you wish, but this video is going to be based on XAMPP. Now you can find XAMPP by googling XAMPP, and you'll find the XAMPP homepage that looks something like this. And depending on your operating system, you'll follow that link for the installation of XAMPP. So I'm using Windows, so I'm going to follow the link to the Windows XAMPP distribution page, and you'll see a list of distributions with the details of what the package contains. What we're particularly interested in is the PHP within the package. So you can scroll a bit and find the most recent version of XAMPP and download it. This link right here should do it. It's 100 and something megabytes. After we click that link, we'll see the distributions and various versions of XAMPP. It's 100 and something megabytes, and you just want to hit, just want to download the installer and get that installed in your machine. I've already installed XAMPP. I've already gotten it configured to some extent, but I'll take you through the details of XAMPP nonetheless. So let's find XAMPP here. Now XAMPP comes with a control panel, and the control panel lists all of the technologies that are available with the XAMPP package. Right now, for this example, we're going to configure Apache. Now there may be other applications on your machine, such as Skype, for instance, that may use up the default port that Apache needs to execute and listen on. A way around that is to configure Apache to listen on a different non-standard port, and it's perfectly fine for your local development distribution. And the way we can do that through XAMPP is by accessing the httpd.conf file, which is Apache's main config file. And we click on this config button to do so. Now I've already configured mine to work on a non-standard port. I've used port 81 instead of port 80. This is not absolutely necessary, but it's only necessary if you try to start Apache and it would not start through the XAMPP control panel. So once this http conf file opens, it should give you an idea of all of the various things that you can configure with Apache. The root directory and all of the various other things, that the modules and so forth. But what we're really interested in right now is this line here. Every time you see listen specifies to Apache what TCP/IP port it will listen on. By default this is port 80, but I've changed it to port 81 to coexist with the list of applications I already have on my machine. Alright. So once you do that, you can change it if you wish, if you do have Skype running on your machine, and if you do have any other applications that may be using port 80 on your local machine, you change it to a non-standard port such as port 81. Now once you do that, you save it and you try to start it. And once started, in your browser window you have to specify that particular port because it's a non-standard port. So for instance, you'll type in something that looks much like localhost, because you're running locally. So localhost by itself assumes port 80, which is the standard port, but since we switched it to the non-standard port of 81, we'll have to enter :81, okay, after localhost. And once we enter that, what should load is the nothing. What should load is XAMPP's default page here. Let's see why that isn't working. Interesting. Oh, I forgot the L. Okay, so once that loads, you'll see the XAMPP control panel here. And from here you may want to do some other things, such as configure your passwords for the MySQL database, for instance. And we'll go ahead and start MySQL, even though we won't be using it in this video walkthrough. Alright, so that started there. Now you may have to approve certain dialogues in relation to your local firewall. That may pop up. I've already configured that, but it's just a matter of clicking allow access, and that should go away. Another thing about this is that it's always it's more efficient to run these services, these programs on the fly rather than create them as fixed Windows services. You can optionally do that, but it's lighter on resources if you only activate it whenever you need it, as opposed to having it running continuously as a service. Alright, so under the XAMPP control panel, we can do a variety of things. For instance, we can check out our PHP environment, all of the details in relation to the PHP language, which absolutely makes no sense at this point considering that we're just starting PHP, but later on we might find this very useful to understand the version of PHP, the capabilities of it, the configuration details, and so forth. Okay, and it's a good place to understand all of the various variables, global variables for instance, that are available that you can pull information from within your PHP scripts. This page, for instance, lists these variables. The ones on the left here are accessible via PHP global variables, and we'll get into that in a bit. But what we're really interested in is security, so we want to secure our system. This may look a little different on your machine since you just set up XAMPP, but the most important thing is to add a password to your MySQL database. Alright, so you do that by typing this in these fields in your MySQL database and clicking on this button here. Alright, it's not wise to leave your MySQL database without a password, especially for the root account. Alright, so once that's configured up, we'll head over and we'll take a look at the installation directory of XAMPP. I've got mine installed on my D drive under apps, and this is what the installation directory of XAMPP looks like. You may notice a directory for Apache, alright, a directory for PHP, a directory for Perl, and many other applications within the stack all reside in this XAMPP directory. But what we're particularly interested in is the htdocs directory. Now this is where we place all of our web applications, all of the websites, all of the resources and so forth that must be served up by this particular web server will be placed inside of the htdocs folder. So let's enter the htdocs folder and see what's in there. Now XAMPP includes a whole bunch of resources here that drive this configuration area here, but what we're going to do is we're going to create our own subdirectory under this directory, and I've already gone ahead and created this particular subfolder. You can create it, give it any name you wish. I gave mine my first web app, and it's just a folder to contain all of the files that are needed for your web application. Alright, so it's always a good idea to modularize things in that regard rather than throw everything in the root directory and have to navigate to it. It's a bit messy that way. So let's go into my first web app here. Alright, so what we see are two resource files, a simple index.html file and a script.php file. Now this particular example is very basic. It should get you in full understanding of the input processing and output model of server-side development. Now a bit about this. Now we understand that server-side applications, any server-side scripting language or programming language that we may encounter, is still a programming language at heart. It still does some processing, and it still is capable of taking logical statements that we define to carry out executions. Now, every program, regardless of whatever it is, whether it's web-based or otherwise, every program has the same input, processing, and output model. We must be able to feed a program input. It must be able to process this input through some collection of logical statements, and it must be able to output results. Now, what would put things into perspective and make you ready for web-based development is if we can identify that input, processing, and output model with web-based systems, as we've already identified them with other development platforms such as desktop-based development, as you would have done in Java and C, for instance. Okay, so let's take a look at the source files, in particular the script here. Now, I'm using Notepad++ as my editor, okay? But you can use any other text-based editor if you wish. And the two files that we just saw in our My First Web App directory are loaded here. The first of which is a simple HTML file with a form, some form syntax, some form markup. What this form does is it defines a simple field called message and a simple button called submit. Okay, but what I want to bring to your attention is this area here, action and post, and method rather. Now, the action wasn't quite used in previous cases, especially in your client-side development course. What action does is it specifies the server-side script that receives the information sent from this form and does some sort of processing on it. Now, it's stated as just script.php, which is perfectly fine because this is what we call a relative path, if you remember relative paths. All of the other bits, such as the domain name and the subdirectory, My First Web App, and so on, we don't have to worry about putting this in, so we're not using absolute paths in that regard. Once the page is served up, this will be inputted automatically through some means in collaboration with the web server and the web browser itself. Okay, so what we need to pay attention to, however, is the relative path from this file, this particular HTML file, which is right here, the index.html, to our scripting file. Alright, now since they're in the same directory, since they're right next to each other, the relative path would just require the name of the resource itself. Okay, now that's what the action attribute takes. The server-side script, or the server-side resource that will be doing some processing on our form data. The second attribute is method. Now, we discussed request methods when we were doing HTTP. We saw a few, but the two most popular request methods that we discussed were get and post. Now, the difference between these two request methods is that get is designed to append any information that must be passed along to the server-side script or server-side web application in the URL. So essentially all of that information that must be passed along to your web application is appended as a query string in the URL using the get method. Remember that. So this is very visible to anyone viewing the address bar in his or her browser once something has been submitted. Similarly, the post uses the same sort of query string, but they don't display it inside of the address bar. They don't append it to the URL. Instead, they put it within the request message. So it's sort of hidden from you, which makes posts more ideal for security oriented submissions, such as entering a username and a password. If get were used in a username and password form, what you'll find is that the password would show up as clear text in the browser's address bar, and that's a no-no. So post is ideal in that regard. In addition, post does not have a limit to the amount of information that can be included in the message. So post is ideal when you have to transfer a lot of information that may be restricted by the URL's character limit. Okay, so in this case we're using post because we're typically in forms we use post. Now that's that's sort of a standard. You can use get if you wish, if the information is very brief and it's not very sensitive, but post is a typical way to go. So I won't explain much about what this does, since you should be quite familiar with HTML, but just imagine that whatever it is, the input itself will be passed in through this particular field with the name message. Now keep that in mind as we go across to our script. So this is our PHP script, and you can imagine that after this is rendered in the browser and the user interacts with it and submits something under this field with the name message, it goes across the internet and our script actually receives this information. And what this script defines is some simple code to receive the information and echo it back to the user. Now this line here is a PHP specific line. What it does is it receives the value inputted by the user under the input field message, as you can see here, as the names correspond, message there and message there, and it saves that value into a variable. Now a bit about PHP and variables and how we can actually get this information into our script. Now PHP has certain super global variables that are able to bring information into your script. Now as developers, you are able to access this information as you wish, so you can access a variety of things from these global variables that PHP makes available to you. Now think of those global variables as input handles. Input handles in the sense of we use them to get information into our program in order to process this information. And this is starting to describe the model that I mentioned, the input processing and output model. So we use these global variables to receive input into our scripts, and similarly we use functions such as echo or print to produce output, to send the information back to the user. So you'll see here, this line here, echo, basically sends the message back to the user along with some other HTML around it. And that's another aspect of PHP. It allows mixed mode coding. So you can mix HTML and some PHP and it'll be perfectly fine when it's rendered in the end. The only difference is that this HTML is not pre-processed, whereas the PHP bits that are delimited by these PHP delimiters here are pre-processed by the engine before it's actually sent back to the browser to be rendered. So you can imagine that whatever the user has entered here will be received, saved in message, and will be echoed back. When it's pre-processed, that actual value will be included with the HTML and sent back to the web browser to be rendered. Alright? So a bit about these input handles again. Request here is an input handle that receives any information coming in through the get or post or head methods. So it combines all of those information, all of the bits and pieces of data that may be coming in either through the get or the post or the head, and it combines them into one array. And we're able to distinguish among the various values in the array given the names of each value, the names that are associated with the values. So message here is a name that is associated with the value that originally came in through this input field on the client side. The name here, message, corresponds with the name message here. So if we were to change this name over here, we would obviously have to change this name here in order to get the same value that's coming through. Alright, so once this is accessed in this way, and always remember they carry an underscore and a $sign. They're prepended by an underscore and a $sign. These PHP global arrays are usually prepended. The super global array, which is globals, is not prepended by an underscore, but the other ones, the subarrays, are prepended by underscores, particularly ones that we get input from. Now a bit about bit more about PHP syntax. It's very convenient. It's built for convenience, and it's built to let's say remove some of the strictness from programming. So for instance, in traditional programming languages, we would have to declare variables before we use them. We would have to specify the particular type, whether it's an int, a boolean, float, etc. But in PHP, all of that is more or less blurred away. We don't necessarily have to declare any variables. As a matter of fact, message here was never declared, but we just state it and use it in one line. Similarly, the message variable here is what we call a scalar variable in PHP, and scalar variables remove the need to define specific types. So we can store anything within a scalar variable. It adapts according to the data type. So we can store a string, we can store an integer, we can store an array even within a scalar variable, and not have to define the type of data. PHP adapts accordingly based on what is assigned. Alright, so that promotes some very convenient programming. You have to be very careful not to overuse it and get a little too slack in your coding. Alright, so there isn't much else I can explain to clarify what we're doing here. This example was designed to be extremely basic. So before I take you through an actual demonstration of what this does, I'll explain how it's supposed to work in the first place. So imagine that we have our page loaded, right? This is our page here. We load it through this particular arrangement. So we'll have our web server. The root of our web server is localhost :801, and we've actually created a subdirectory, if you recall, called my first web app, within which we have our two files, our HTML file and our script.php, and this is under the my first web app subdirectory. Corresponding to this subdirectory, we type in our browser window my first web app to access the files within that subdirectory. So you can imagine that based on our root directory, our htdocs, this here takes us to our htdocs, and then we have to specify where to go from there within the document root of the web server itself. So once we access that through our browser, through our running web server, we can officially access our interface, a simple HTML interface that we've coded up here. Alright, so I'll proceed to test it out. I'll enter a message such as hello world, and I'll hit submit. Now what happens when I hit submit is that this value entered in the field with the name message will be sent across from the browser to the web server to the script called script.php over here. Now when script.php grabs that message that I originally entered, hello world in this case, it will take it from this particular input handle and save it inside of this scalar variable message, and then it will begin to generate a response. HTML code will be sent directly to the output stream to compose the response, but as soon as it hits these PHP delimiters, it starts to pre-process whatever's within the delimiters. So it understands that echo is a function that describes writing something, writing a variable or some sort of value that is PHP specific to the output stream. So what it's going to do, what echo is going to do here is going to look inside of message, which is our scalar variable, take out the value that was originally entered, that was passed over to this script on the server side, and then print it out just like these are printed out or typed out in this regard. So you'll find that our message will be appended to this line. Now another bit about mixed mode coding is that it saves a lot in terms of insertions, and for instance, if we were to use the traditional sense of just appending HTML in a string, for instance, we would have to use a lot of appending signs. What I mean by this is this. So for instance, we would do output, and then we would have to type in string literals HTML, etc., etc. And that's a bit sloppier, especially in this reverse. But instead, PHP allows us to just declare the HTML as is, and it will take care of that on our behalf. So we can have a bit of a cleaner representation of code that does not need to be preprocessed, and still be able to insert code that needs to be preprocessed, as long as we include these PHP delimiters. Okay? So a point to note with respect to this sidebar is that as long as you're putting stuff that is logically related, that is supposed to constitute server-side processing, we have to delimit them so that the interpreter that goes through these PHP scripts knows what to preprocess and what to send directly to the output stream. Anyway, so once this information comes across to the server side and is saved in message and is outputted here, we should see this particular result. And take a look at the address bar as I hit submit. Okay, so we see here in the submit output, we have our message. You typed hello world, and I did actually type hello world in that field, but we have pass control to our server-side script called script.php. Alright, so that's as basic as we can get. It demonstrates how we can get input into our application. It demonstrates some level of processing, which does assignment. In this case, it's not to pronounce the processing that's happening, but we'll go through an example that takes us through a bit more of a better example of processing. And it demonstrates how to get it back to the user, how to output the result through echo. Sometimes persons use print, right? Alright, so a couple of things, a couple of points to note is that students typically double click on files. They do this inadvertently. So for instance, if they're authoring files like we are, and they're creating a server-side script and we're creating an HTML file, you might be tempted to double click on it to run it. Now, even though it renders like this, what you'll find is that it doesn't work the way we expect it to work. Alright, so if you look at this, it does pass control to the script, but we see the actual source code of the script. And this is because instead of going through the web server, we're going through the local file system. So keep in mind that whenever you get a result like this, you are not passing your application through the web server. Instead, you're passing it through the local file system. So to make sure that you follow this, always remember to access the browser window and hit your localhost, alright, and type in your particular script through the address bar in the browser to test it out. Okay? Alright, so what we're going to do now is we're going to try to augment this just a bit to show you a better example of server-side processing. And what we're going to do in this case is we're going to add some sort of validation, server-side validation. So let me demonstrate here. So if I hit submit here, what happens is that it allows me to submit the information, which is absolutely nothing, and it prints this. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some simple PHP syntax to test the value of message, and if message is absolutely blank, we're going to print you type nothing. Okay, so we're going to open this space here, and then you're going to use a simple if statement. As I mentioned, PHP is C based, so we can type something to the effect of if message. Alright, and sometimes, you know, it might be a space or a couple of spaces and so on. PHP affords us quite a lot of functions to do some tidying up and a variety of things in terms of string manipulation. Alright, So we can do something to the effect of if message dot trim. Right? Sorry, I'm a little I'm in object-oriented mode right now. It's really trim message in PHP, so it's a function. So if trim message is equal to null, something to that effect, then we say message is equal to nothing. Now PHP allows you to use double quotes or single quotes on strings, and you'll see why, especially in cases when you need to do mixed mode coding. So double quotes or single quotes, same thing in PHP. They define string literals. Alright, as you would know in other languages, single quotes denote characters, but in PHP they're not particularly strict about data types, so the double quotes or single quotes are okay, and they are interchangeable. Alright, so they work really well. So let's try this out. So what it does, it trims the message, so in the event that we have a couple of spaces, it will take those off, and if we have absolutely nothing left, then you know we will resolve to null, and message will be by default set to nothing. Okay, so let's test this out. So I'll go back to our page and I'll hit submit. You type nothing. Similarly, if you type a couple of spaces, hit submit, you type nothing. This is the simple code here at work. Okay, so that's as much as I'd like to cover in this segment. It should get you started. As I mentioned, PHP is C based, so much of the constructs such as for loops and while loops and so forth and switch statements hold in a similar manner in PHP to get you started. To recap, what's important is to understand how to get information into your script, and request is a good way to go. Alright, since it consolidates the get, post, and head results in one array. And the way we actually grab that information from a corresponding form is to ensure that the name of the particular field corresponds with the name that we place in these square brackets. Okay? Alright, as I mentioned, this is how we access associative arrays, values of associative arrays in PHP. Okay? And that's as simple as we can get. The language is pretty straightforward. It's one of the easiest languages to pick up on and learn. Alright? So